Okay, so I've clicked the go live button, and this is famously where my internet will stop working. Now, we do know that Erin is currently frozen, as I can see here. So I don't know whether Erin can have video or whether he's having internet troubles. It turns out that this week is the week of internet woes. The internet is on holiday and will be back shortly. Hello, good evening, everybody.
Hello. Should we do an introduction? Because that was terrible.
I'm no good at introductions. It took me half an hour at a barbecue to introduce Clarine to anybody.
Oh, hello, everybody. How are you all? We're here with me and him, with Jan and Mikey and Erin, although Erin is having video trouble, so may not stream his video for now because we've been having latency issues. Erin, how are you?
I am. I hopefully you can hear a bit robotic.
It is being robotic.
It's being robotic. We can kind of hear you.
Oh man, I'll tell you what. It's absolutely fantastic. We live in a world where internet connectivity is usually perfect, and we've been chatting for the last 20 minutes, and then just before we go live, this happens.
It does. And how's all the people in the chat? Hello, everybody. I see Arthur. I see Jelly. I see Dovahkiin.
Good to see you all. So we're going to go through a couple of things tonight. Jan's got a surprise later on. And we've got Erin back on. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to talk with him.
I can hear him.
Yes, excellent. So, 2 weeks ago, my internet failed, and that was a great launch. But actually, it was a great launch. So, Erin's new course is out. It's been out for a couple of weeks now, and I think 15. I was looking at the figures earlier. 15 people have already finished it, which is amazing. So they've been.
Hello, Jessica. Hello, Melicon. Hello, Erin. Can you hear us now?
I can hear. I can hear.
Nice. That's much better. Less robotic.
Nice.
So should we talk about okay, so basically we have 2 weeks to catch up with because last week we couldn't stream, and the week before we tried to stream but we couldn't stream, and now we can, and I'm full of instant coffee.
I haven't had too much coffee, so I will be mellow Mike this evening. Hello.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So first of all, Kyle's here. Hi, Kyle. How are you doing?
Hi,
Long time no see.
Kyle might be better at being Jan than I am. So if you want to be Jan on Discord, I understand.
Nice. I'm going to, just in case people are unaware of the course, I'm just going to make sure that we have Erin's course in the chat right now.
So I think 2 weeks ago we launched, or Mikey and Erin launched. I just sat there looking pretty. Ooh, video.
Trying it.
Look at that. Launched the procedural materials in Blender course. And the course went very well. We had a little chat in Discord, but we didn't actually get to do one of these streams. So why don't we start with the very basics? And Erin, what's procedural materials?
That's actually a really good question. Not one I've really thought about before. I guess just not using image textures, having the control in your hands rather than using, usually you call them like destructive workflow processes. So that's like destructive modeling is when you actually make a model manually, or destructive textures would be like a baked out texture, which is what you require for a game, right? If you're exporting things out to Godot, then you're going to need to bake those. But if you want to be working procedurally, and even just something as simple as like changing the white balance on an image, that's like a procedure being done, and then the data on the other side of that procedure has been changed.
So you mentioned destructive modeling, and the one that I always come back to is this idea, the Michelangelo idea. The sculpture is in the block of marble. You just have to remove the marble until you've got the sculpture. That's destructive modeling. You start with your cube, you remove bits until it's the thing you want. But procedural is you tell Blender or Godot, whatever you're using, here are the rules, make something with these rules. And if your rules are done right, if the recipe is good, I'm going to mix my metaphors, then your statue is tasty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a giant gummy bear. Michelangelo's gummy bear.
But I think that's really you can come up with some really good solutions that way, because things in nature are things are the product of the environments that generate them. And so if you're making your materials in the same way, if you have a material working on a specific bit of mesh, and that mesh is part of the inputs, whether it's positioning certain colors on certain, like if it faces upwards more, it'll get more grass on it. Then your material can become really specific to the thing. It becomes much more appropriate for its environment. It becomes much more natural, the process is. So
yeah, it's really it can really help make a scene dynamic. Just like that grass doesn't grow on horizontal things, but also snow settles on anything facing upright. And moss grows on just 1/4 of a tree. That sort of thing could all be done procedurally. Now, there are some benefits, as we want everybody to have a procedural workflow. There are many, 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 many benefits to the procedural workflow, but there are also some disadvantages as well. And I think it's important that people realize that it's once again, it's a tool. Like most things, it's a tool, and if you use it in a time-consuming manner, I think that's the biggest one, isn't it, Aaron?
yeah, I mean, if you're going to use it once for a very specific thing, then you're kind of better off doing a bit of texture painting, or even just painting your masks manually. Because if you're going to spend 2 days making a shader where you already have an image texture that would work great, then you kind of shot yourself in the foot. But if you're doing 500 assets, then it's a perfect opportunity.
If you're doing 500 assets, or if it's something that's going to change a lot over time. Because I remember we played a little bit with, we played quite a lot with procedural level generation in one of our courses in our Cops and Robbers game. What do we call it? Gotta Get Away.
Yeah.
And we wanted a randomly generated city. And it's something like that, you just give it some rules. You're not going to create 50 levels and say pick one at random. You're going to give it the rules. Or something like when you've got, the hill has to work this way. If each time you render it, you're going to tweak the layout a little bit, the material's going to look right each time.
Yeah.
But if it's a one-off handcrafted level or scene, maybe that's not the right answer.
One of the great things with any procedural workflow, and it's not just textures and things like that. Procedural is just using a number basically, or a slider, or something to control something else. And one of the great things you can do is you can generate, let's say, 200 of something with a button click after you've generated whatever algorithm or which nodes you've connected up. You can create a load of results and then just curate those rather than trying to make them all manually in the first place.
And you can surprise yourself, which is always fun.
Yes.
You get really interesting, complex results from quite simple rules.
Yeah. Generative stuff is always really interesting.
So in the course, the final product is a little kitchen scene. What's the bit you're proudest of?
This sounds really nerdy, but the demonstration of the Mix RGB node, I think it's so neat. I think it's so cool when you put noise and linear light, and you just see it it goes the same way. It's like a bipolar transform. Some bits go up, some bits go down. There's no I just think it's amazing. I use it all the time. It's a bit of a brand on my Discord server. It's just anybody uses, if I make anything, it will have linear light somewhere in it.
Nice.
But I just you got to have the little things. It's the little things that you love.
I think that's one of the biggest things when using Blender to generate something procedurally, is you can see it live before you. So you're tweaking these values and you're not really waiting for something to be generated. It can literally be molded in front of you, and you can change parameters, and it changed so drastically from one value to another. So occasionally you have to use something like a math node to restrict it, so you're not moving it little anymore. You can move a slider quite a lot rather than trying to get minute numbers dialed in. But
it's also something really satisfying about moving a slider and seeing everything on the screen change just the way you want it. It sounds petty, but it's fun. Just sitting there with your supervillain laugh going.
No, you raise a good point there about fun, though. I mean, a moment ago we were saying that using procedural stuff can be a bit of a time sink, but whilst you're experimenting and learning, it's definitely not a time sink, because it's at that point you're going to learn that, hey, this is really cool. But when it comes down to production or something, say you wanted to create 100 assets for something, suddenly you realize that the power of having something procedural or having a script that you can run on your assets and actually generate edgeware very, very quickly and export them. Now, you may be going back to them later and tweaking them and everything, but now they look worn and reasonable in like a game or something along those lines. So you can really use them to help benefit a workflow, and even if you come back to it later and curate it or polish it up and make it look more unique, because that's one of the other things you can end up with. I know it's one of the downsides of using just the presets, which is essentially what you're creating, is something like Substance Painter. Suddenly all of your assets can look, it's lovely, they look like they're part of one set, but now all of your assets always look like they're part of one set. So you do have to sort of balance everything out.
For making large numbers of assets as well, it's just like I spent the last 3 hours today making flowers with geometry nodes, and now I have, like that's 3 hours that I could have spent. If I'd modeled it, I would have probably done 2 flowers, but I ended up making 3 algorithms that make flowers. So I have foxgloves, chrysanthemums, and daisies, and I exported 40 flowers in that time. I mean, that's like, it's such a valuable thing to be able to do, and it's like people get scared of the maths, but it's so visual. Like it's not like, oh, I need to know to add 4. It's like, it's too low, so I'm going to add something to it and make it higher. It's not really, I think it's maths in quite an abstract sense. It's just like you're pushing stuff around, and it just happens to be numbers that you're using to push with.
It reminds me, I can't remember who did the video, but it reminds me of the guy who did a series of videos on creating procedural assets for games in Blender. And he did a demonstration on making guns, another one on making mechs. He basically wrote a little Python script, and then he had some attachment nodes, and then you could just generate and make as many unique assets as you wanted to. In the same way that kind of Houdini does, but now you don't have to pay for Houdini.
That sounds very much like Curtis's mech generator to me.
That could be.
It sounds like it, yeah.
I watch more Godot content than
Yes.
Jelly says, next month I need the course. Yes, number one stopping point for me in environment is making flowers and grass. Yeah, no, I can see that.
I mean, as a artist, if you're starting out your journey, yes, you're going to want to make absolutely everything that you can possibly try and model, if nothing else for the experience. And then later on in your career, you'll want to not make flowers and buy them.
Could you okay that link that Arthur just put through, because no one can see it yet?
It says message retracted on my screen.
Oh, retracted. Never mind. I thought it's It's all posts a link, then you have to okay it. It may not have been a link. Yeah, Food Fight was a fun game. And we've actually got some news about that in a little bit, so we'll talk about that in a second. But it's interesting because Mikey and I were talking today about there's a game Mikey and I made a long time back. Well, I say a long time back, 3 years back. And we're saying it'd be great to expand this. And one of the things we'd like to do is a little character unlock. So you have these little people running around, and you play a game. If you win, you get X points. If you lose, you get X minus Y points, whatever. And you can use them to unlock something or get a random reward. And if you design your character so that you've got a modular point, so here's where the hat goes, here's where the gloves go, here's where the boot goes, and then you create the right procedural content, you can make hundreds of assets in a couple of hours, as opposed to sit there with a pen and paper and say, okay, let's design 50 pairs of boots.
Yeah. Although you can end up with things going a bit wonky as well. Sometimes setting up a system like that takes as long as it would take to create the assets that you could have made in the first place. So you have to pick and choose when you're going to use this technique. And if you want a really customizable game, I mean, that is the way forward. But like most things, it's good to pick that right at the very beginning when you decide when your game design document, essentially, or even your asset design document if you're just an artist working in Blender. If you know what outcome you're going for, you can really just nail it on the head and just go that direction. One of the pain points Jan and I have had in the past when creating a game or anything along those lines is you end up with a bit of scope slip, but then you realize when you're too far into a project, changing that one thing and trying to go back again is actually quite a big problem.
We had that on Mag Racer when you came up with these really cool, like changing how we could apply team paints. It's like, yes, but we'd have to redesign everything about how teams work. It's like, it's a really cool system. It's like, it's a great system
for the next game.
But we're starting again at this point. Like, this is.
I mean, it has been done. I can't. I'm sure someone in the comments will think of a game that has started off in Duke Nukem's Forever. That was a great example of a game.
Was it
that took ages?
Was it a great example of a game?
Well, I don't know. But that aside, it's a great example of how a game can be recreated again and again and again.
Star Citizen is a great example, and this is no. I'm not throwing shade on the game, but there's been so much added to it over time that's led to more people investing. That has led to the designers saying, "Let's add more features." To the point where I don't know if this thing's ever getting released. I mean, I hope it is. I haven't paid for it, but I hope the people who have paid for it get their full game. But at a certain point, you have to stop and think, could this be an expansion? Like, could you not just release the game?
Yeah, definitely. I think they've said yes to too many things.
Yes.
is basically it. And it's very tempting, though. I'm just going to post Erin's YouTube channel, as we've just had a question. He's shouting at me through my speakers.
I know that voice.
There you go. There's Erin's channel just there as well.
But going back to procedural content, it's not going to be right for everything you do. But if you learn the techniques and you get to play with it, then you'll have a much better understanding on when you want to use that design and that workflow and when you don't. Just learning this is a technique, now it's the only technique I'm going to use is not great.
Yes, the old adage, if you're the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything's a nail. But yeah, in terms of procedural modeling, we actually cover a little bit of that using the modifier stack in Godot Getaway. There's a great example where if you can't decide, we use a fire hydrant, I believe. And
I don't know if Aaron's seen Godot Getaway, has he?
I don't believe I have.
We should have prepared the game and got him to play it. We could all be cops and robbers, of course. That'd be awesome.
Well, I was just going to find a sales video to share, but you know.
That and the buildings. The buildings are made in such a way that we use drivers in Blender, and I hope the new spreadsheet feature of 2.93, if they actually get that in there, will be amazing for this. But we use drivers to link everything together, so that when you adjust the number of floors the building has, it automatically updates the fire escapes and the number of windows and everything else. So you can end up having assets being generated very quickly by just changing one particular value. You don't have to manually place all of those things. And of course, if you want to at the end, you can press apply everything, and then perhaps break one of the fire escapes and make it look a bit more unique. So that's another thing that procedural generation of anything, or that word, modeling.
Generative.
And that's the one. It's great for a starting point. It's a bit like having a base mesh to work from, essentially.
Yep.
That's something that we're going to see more and more with geometry nodes as well. I always end up coming back to geometry nodes just because it's what I'm sort of living in at the moment. But it's because it's essentially a modifier on its own. So if you have something, if you've downloaded like a geometry nodes asset or something like that, where it's, I don't know, a node group that makes a bridge, for example, then you can just drop it on whatever you need it to be on, turn that thing into a bridge, and then you could just apply it, and that's your bridge. Or you could move your things around, and all of those drivers that previously we would have done manually and typed them in and linked them all together, and that don't always come across when you append assets, or like you think you have them all, but then one thing is missing. All of those things will just be contained within a node tree. So,
or someone says, could you make them all slightly more orange?
That is always an issue.
You just give them orange tinted glasses and go, there you go.
Do you intend to create another big game course? I love Gotta Getaway. Yes, we do.
Do you think that would be a nice segue to...
Yeah, because that actually leads us to the other thing we were talking about earlier. That is not a promise. It's just something we were discussing today.
I'll let Jan talk, otherwise I'm going to drop him in it.
I mean, the first thing to talk about is a few years back, I did a course called Discovering Godot, which was learning Godot 3 from absolute beginner, what is a variable, all the way up to local multiplayer 3D third-person shooter. And I did that with another company. And the licensing agreement I have with them was for a fixed amount of time, and it's coming to an end, and they give you the content back. So we're going to be publishing that on our own name, on our website, and probably on the Udemy as well. And we're very excited about it, and I've gone through and been re-editing it. And the reason you haven't seen any new content from me for 2 weeks is not because I've been asleep and playing with my toucan, but because I've been editing flat out. I'm a little bit sleepy, but I've actually finished the vast majority of the courses. It's good to go from next month. If you've already bought that on Udemy, you have access to that. So even when they, close down their version of the course, that's a lifetime access. Udemy gives you that content. You lose nothing. You're not losing anything. But if you want to follow it through us, either through our Udemy page or our Teachable page, or if you have lifetime access, you now have access to that content. Part of what we did for that course was a fun little game called Cube Dude Kickabout, which is a game that Mikey and I originally made in 4 hours, having just met each other. And it's just a fun little 2-player football/soccer game with toys. Like I found a little wooden sound effect when you kick the ball, it goes. And you score a goal and you hear a little and stars come up and there's a air horn sound. And there's a teddy bear that Jelly made in the background. It's very cute. And we're looking at this and we're thinking, we could probably expand this. Like it'd be really fun to make like a character creator module in Blender where you can actually just like design a bunch of assets for this game and talk about what needs to go into this. And then go into Godot and say, okay, so we have the basic thing we did in this other course. We're going to take that as read. We can make this very quickly in a few videos. Or even just include that part in the other. No, we can't do that easily. But anyway. But we can also talk about things like, do we do this online? Is this now an online multiplayer game? How many players are in it? Are we going to have a campaign mode? Are we going to have character unlocks and progression? All of this is not a promise.
We are not making Championship Manager or FIFA.
On top of that, there is Mag Racer, which we did originally want to make as a course. Unfortunately, we launched the Kickstarter just as the pandemic reached a really critical point, and a whole bunch of people were like, I want to pledge money, but I don't actually have any. So that's now on a back burner to be made into a game, but Mag Race is a lot of fun.
It is.
We
should definitely resurface Gotta Get Away, and maybe on a stream coming up in the next couple of weeks, perhaps play a couple of the games, have a nostalgia trip down these, and maybe even be a bit critical of our own games, because now it's long enough since we've actually played them that we can look back at them with a critical eye, and it's almost like looking at someone else's work when you haven't looked at something.
It really is, especially when you're looking at code or content you made like a year ago, 2 years ago, and you're like, I forgot I did that. That's really good. Yes, Jelly points out existing students of Discovering Godot lose nothing. You have that content. It's anyone who wants it from now on will just get it through us. Exactly the same stuff. Nothing has changed. As part of that, I need to redo some of the later videos because they weren't quite up to snuff. But I finished it up to the end of Cube Dude Kickabout, so that course is almost fully done. And the plan is to release it at the beginning of April, probably April Fool's Day, which is a bad time to be releasing a big thing. But
it's like a genuine release. That's why we're talking about it now.
It's just under 20 hours of content. It'll work. I mean, it's written in Godot 3.1. It'll work in Godot 3.x.
Yeah.
It won't work in Godot 4. Godot 4 will be the next huge thing I do. But we do want to make some more game courses, like Canopy Cars, which I had to put the back burner to finish this in time for April. Is a fun little project, but it's not a big project. We could make that a big project. Mag Racer could be a big project, but that is such a big project that I don't think that's let's take 8 months of not teaching to put this course together.
Well, it's one of those things. It's so much fun working on large projects because they're very fulfilling. But we've also seen so much change. I mean, I'll talk about Blender, but Godot is going to be exactly the same. Blender's had such a dramatic change in the last 2 years alone that it's difficult when you create a really large entity of keeping track of absolutely everything. And Aaron here will attest to the fact that geometry nodes is changing on an almost daily basis at the moment. Was it the sockets were changing color? The
sockets were changing color. 2 days ago, there was a change, and I sent somebody the file and was like, "Oh, can you just check this?" And then they opened it and they were like, "Nope, nothing's loading." And then they had changed something, and then the next day they had fixed it, but then the day after that there was like some other change which broke something else. So it's like you're in hot water if you're trying to make content for this stuff.
Yeah, and so when it comes to courses, it really helps when a package has settled down, especially when it's great on YouTube being able to show you a video, but I've had comments in the past when someone says, "Oh, this doesn't work anymore," or "Why didn't you use this technique?" And of course, that technique didn't exist when you originally recorded it, and the thing that you had done did work. I mean, the classic one, and Jelly will attest to this as well. This is my word of the evening, apparently, attest. Is remove doubles. Merge by distance it changed to. But of course, every time that comes up, people are, if they're just listening and following along on screen, they're looking for something called remove doubles, and it's just not there. Yeah.
Isn't it still remove doubles in the code?
Yeah.
Like if you do it through Python, it's
if
still...
you do it through Python, that was a bugbear in me because I was looking at the Python API and I kind of had a little tantrum when I saw it.
It's interesting because I looked at one of the things we're interested in is, for those of you who don't know Mag Racer, I feel like we should show Mag Racer at this point. For those of you who don't know Mag Racer, it's kind of a reaction to you can't make fast, big 3D games in Godot. Yeah, you can. I mean, you have to optimize and know what you're doing.
We had a very interesting thing with AMD graphics cards.
Yes. And the drivers that Godot is using don't fully work. So if you don't fully work with AMD like they do 90% of the time.
Was it anti-aliasing was the problem?
Turn on anti-aliasing, you lose 90% of the frame rate on an AMD card. So we had to make that an option because if you have an AMD card, you can't play the game.
And it's interesting because we were actually making a game rather than just making a more abstract course about something. It's you actually come across these real world problems, and it stumped us for a couple of weeks until we worked out what was going on.
I looked at what will this look like under Godot 4, because Godot 4 is not an incremental change, it's a massive rebase. They're shifting over to Vulkan. The new lighting engine is incredible. The new pathfinding is very good. It's just a huge change. Can you just convert what we have right now to the current nightly build of Godot 4? No, you can't. You can't even do it with Canopy cards because the way 3D objects are being put together, the way textures are being made, has changed. So you can't just easily drag it from there to there. So when it comes closer to launch, they're going to have a much better conversion process. Like right now, it's not even an alpha. It's a nightly build, or not a public alpha. But at the current stage, you can't just transfer things across. But I'm really interested to see what we could do with Godot 4. I'm really interested to see if we can rope Aaron into Mag Racer, because there's some cool stuff you can do in there.
Yeah, I really want to. I want to get into doing Godot stuff. It sounds like such a great platform, and the community really as well is really cool.
Yeah, it is. They had a bit of a internal argument recently over we need to change the logo. No, we don't. Yes, we do. Because someone said the logo is not professional. It's a logo.
Yeah,
I mean, it really the Nike logo is a swoosh. The Blender logo is, I don't even know what that is. It's a mutant bunny rabbit.
It was very briefly an avocado as well.
Was it?
A long time ago, yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff happening. I do like making big game projects. The downside of the big game projects is you have to kind of set aside 6 to 8 months. Because you have to develop the prototype game and the assets. And it's not just a question of me saying, okay, I'm going to set aside 6 to 8 months. Mikey, can you keep throwing money at me? It's, Mikey, I need
Yeah, it's
6 gigs worth of assets or whatever it is. Can you stop recording and make them for me? Right.
which
So
I'm hoping we can get into a position in the next couple of years where we can do some bigger projects like that. And one of the things with game, and good evening, Azrael Studios, how you
Ezra,
doing? One of the big things when you're working on a game or any actual client project, I'd say as well, and correct me here if I'm wrong on this, Aaron, is a lot. If you were teaching the entire process, there is a lot of repetition because you're often and in a tutorial or in a fully fledged course, you don't want to do too much of that. I mean, it's really, handing it back over to the student at that point and saying, look, you've now got the tools and the experience of how to use them. What can you actually make from them? Because that's when you're going to learn the most about it essentially. But if you then, I think one of my crowning moments was putting tiles on a roof. And of course, you can do this in so many ways. But at the moment, we're just moving assets around. We're just or cubes, flattened cubes around, and it is a matter of placing it, duplicating it, moving it across, duplicating those two, move them across, duplicating those, moving them across. And you don't need to be shown that too many times before you realise, well, actually, I think I've got this.
well, it's like the conversation we had last month about Canopy cars. Do I show you the video footage of how to go through all 20 vehicles and set up the wheels and the attributes of each car, the weight, the engine, the rest of it? Or do I show you how to do 2 of them and then just give you the files?
Yeah.
Because for a tutorial, you don't really need to be going through that.
You just need that splash screen up a few hours
If you
later.
didn't get it, you can just go back and watch that bit again, right?
Yeah.
It's not like in a classroom where the repetition is going to be part of it. It's tricky because some people would prefer to make the assets themselves, but to those people, don't use my files.
Oh, one of the other things, of course, is when you're doing something highly repetitive, I try and keep the footage in there of me doing it, and then doing a talk over, just explaining what's going through my mind at the time and why I'm doing it this way. And in the early days, when we are just moving around a flattened cube, for instance, I talk about how there are other more optimal ways of doing this and why this isn't such a great idea. But at the same time, you're getting the experience in Blender of moving objects around, which will come in so handy later on. Why are we not using? I can see the comments already. Why are you not using an array modifier? Why are you not? Because someone's just learned how to move something that's it's not run yet.
That's one of the interesting things about making tutorials is trying to figure out what's a good baseline for assumed knowledge. Because one of the problems or one of the things people say about stuff like the Discovering Godot course is the first section is too basic. And like, yes, if you already know what a variable is, you can skip these videos.
Yeah.
But if you don't, you really need to watch this. Because if you don't understand variable, array, and probably dictionary, it doesn't matter if you understand functions. Like everything after that's going to be weird and mysterious. You kind of need that understanding.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, you've got to assume. I've always included like an installation of Blender video, and I often think to myself, is this really necessary? But then you actually look at the installation of Blender. Hi, Daz, how you doing? You look at the installation of Blender, and if you wanted 2.83 long-term service version or the long-term support version, that's not just under the download options. You have to go off and find that. If you want the latest alpha build, you can't use Steam to get that. You have to go directly to the Blender's website and go to the nightly build section. If you want it to automatically update, then you're going to probably want to use something like Steam to install it. But then there's the danger of it updating and breaking something. So, or perhaps you want multiple versions of Blender installed. So, looking back on it, something from a student's perspective, you may be thinking, "Oh, well, why would I want to learn how to install Blender? That's easy." But there are various ways of doing it, as most things are in life and in Blender. So it's interesting to see different facets, and sometimes people come back and go, "Oh, I didn't know you could get the latest version from there."
When you're dealing with international communities, not everything was taught. Like I've never had a calculus class. It was never taught to me in maths. I'm of a generation and of a school system where in the 90s in Britain, calculus was advanced mathematics. When I was teaching in the States, every single one of my students knew calculus. When I was doing my education training, they showed us a video of kids from Harvard, or adults from graduating Harvard in the early 90s. And they were all asked to explain the seasons. And they all got it wrong. They asked 25 people, and they started talking about elliptical orbits, and the entire Earth is close to the sun and all the rest of it. And it's like, I mean, yes, the orbit is slightly elliptical, but it's the tilt. It's not the, it's, to me, that's obvious because that was taught to me when I was 8. But it turns out a lot of these people didn't have that lesson, and it's assumed knowledge, right? I think that this is obvious.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, but hopefully we rise to that challenge and inspire a new generation of artists. I mean, that's that's one of the great things about the node system within Blender. It's a very visual way of coding. Essentially, you might not feel like you're coding, but you are. I mean, there are some things that I wish that could happen, like iterations. If you could just have a block that says do this 4 times, that in Blender at the moment you have to have stacks of groupings basically, and then link them all together, and it's just a copy of each other. So there are things like iterations that would be really, really useful. I'm sure they're working on it in the background, but iterations are also dangerous because if you can cause an infinite loop, yeah.
I mean, even just now, if you reference one object in geometry nodes, and then in another tree you reference the object that's referencing your object now, then that's immediately created a loop, and it will just immediately crash to the desktop. And a lot of people, I've seen people being like, I don't understand why I can't do this. Like, I want to put my flowers on my flowers, or something like that. And it's like, well, you're referencing the thing that's being referenced, that's then going to try and reference the thing it's referencing, and it just doesn't. It's not having a great time. So
it reminds me of when people are first starting with Godot and they haven't quite got their head around how instancing works in Godot, because it's not quite like prefabs in Unity. For example, we're going to create a player template, and it's got a material. And now we're going to instance a scene, and this is going to be player 1, and player 1 has its own material. So we just change the material. Then we go back to the template, and that material is different because they're both using that material. We haven't created a new copy. We have just changed this instance, and that's one material. If you want a different material, now create an instance material, or there's a solution you have to do. And it's really easy to forget that because it feels like a whole new object. It's not a whole new object. If you change this material, everything that uses that material will change. That was one of the huge problems I had when I was putting together the prototype for Godot Getaway, was you can change the color of your car. You absolutely can. But you go into the game, and every single car you see on your side is the color you picked, and every single color that Mikey sees is the color he picked. Because I forgot that they're all the same material.
Yeah.
So if you change car material, everyone's car on the client side will change to that color.
That happens in Blender as well.
Yeah.
It's very easy to think that a material belongs to an object. And I think there is actually a way in Blender to link it that way around, but it's not by default. It is a material, and it's just a data block that the object is accessing. So you end up, and I'm thinking about actually talking about that a lot earlier on in the bundle of how the data actually works within Blender, because when you understand how the hierarchy works, you suddenly get an appreciation as to why you can't do certain things.
Well, it's interesting when you have that sort of epiphany of, oh, that's how it's structured, and here are the implications. Do you remember that physics book we had in Godot Getaway? Where this was a really weird one.
Which one?
We create a ball, and it's a physics object. So it just moves by physics. And our vehicles are physics objects, right? But we're going over the network. So every frame, Mikey's going to send his transform to me because I'm the host, and I'm going to tell him where everything is. Great. So we set this all up. We put the ball in the scene. I drive into the ball rolls around the place. Mikey drives into the ball, and nothing happens. It doesn't move.
In fact, it stops my car like a brick wall.
It stops his car. And we're trying to figure this out. And eventually we realize transform is not a property of physics body in Godot. Transform is a property of node. Physics doesn't rely on the transform. It relies on the energy and the mass. So if you want to move something over a network, you can't send the transform, because all you've done is teleport something 60 frames a second. You haven't actually moved it. It looks like it's moving. It's not moving.
You have to send
It
across
has
its
no
velocity
force.
and things like that.
Right. There is nothing to impart to the ball. They're just occupying the same space. And if they're occupying the same space, then whichever one has priority is going to win. And if it's the ball, the car will go backwards and the ball will stay still. And it was such a weird moment of like, it's not actually moving. It just looks like it's moving. But if I do it through physics, then Godot will think it's moving and the ball will fly around the place.
Yeah, Daz raises a great point. It's a huge rabbit hole when you start looking under the bonnet of how programs reference and link things together, and it can be incredibly confusing. And not, I would say that when you're, because with linking you can actually create really complex scenes, and you can set it up so, let's say all three of us got into modeling and we wanted to make a Jan's going to do a human model, but you can update that separately and it's linked into the scene, so it would just automatically update on the next reload, which is absolutely fantastic. But the way that the proxy system works in Blender is very confusing to a newcomer, because if you just bring in a proxy, you can't move it. It's locked in whatever position it was in the original file, which kind of seems a bit backwards, because when you first look at it, you're like, well, how do I make this building out of all these parts if they're all locked to the origin? But you can very easily end up breaking those links and then they don't update, and you cannot repair them once you've broken them. That's the... I'm sure you could if you really wanted to, but it would just be a real nightmare to try and repair those broken links. You would literally have to just go through the process again and maybe just replace the model data. That might work. But anyway, as you can see here, just thinking about how it's all linked together is rather confusing.
Dad raises a point about why, since Godot uses component models and object-oriented programming, why you couldn't have two scripts on a node. In Godot, why can you only have one script on a node? Bear in mind, I'm not part of the engine development team. I'm not qualified. They are better coders than I am. Each node is one thing, right? Each node is supposed to be, it's basically single responsibility theory, right? That node does that one thing. So if you want to have multiple scripts on an object, you put a script on each node.
Yeah.
If you've got one node that does everything, it's like having one script in your game that runs every character. It's not, it's not supposed to do that. So the good example is in Godot Getaway, when we're doing Hobby Days, the little cute bunny platformer thing. We move the animation from the player node down to the animation subnode, and we just pass through, here's my velocity, and let the animation player figure out what animation is playing, because the player doesn't need to know what the animation is doing. Right? The player just needs to know, where am I moving? Have I collided with anything?
It makes a lot of sense separating things out like that.
Yeah.
Well, it also means if you're paying attention and you've planned it well, if you need to swap anything out or if something breaks, it'll just break that. I mean, ideally, when you're doing single responsibility properly, you should be able to remove any node or any subscript and it won't break the game. That's the goal. I'm not always that focused, I guess is the word. Baz is very good at this. Bastian is very, very good at making sure that every node is properly typed and it's error checking. And if you're getting an error, just ignore this script and all the rest of it. I'll do it, but sometimes I forget.
I've caught myself out. So one of the things I always encourage students to do is name things as they go, or in the case of nodes, group them. So you've not got spaghetti everywhere. If this small collection of things does one thing, put them together, package it up. Then you're not going to break it later on. That's one of the important things. And naming stuff. No end will you have a project that says cube
77. Yeah.
And I make a little bit of a joke out of it because in the beginning of the very sort of intro to Blender for complete beginners, that I do make a building out of loads of cubes. I mean, what else am I going to name them? They are cubes, so you end up with this naming structure. But I've seen like incredible. There's a Black Hawk tutorial out there somewhere, as in the helicopter, and it's absolutely fantastic. And then they're going through the hierarchy trying to find something, and it's like curve 67. I'm like,
Yep.
if you just, but what do you know? You know, if you've got bolts on something, it will say bolt 372. And hopefully with collections
like-
now in Blender, you can.
Yeah, collections. I was going to say, use your hierarchies to your advantage. Like if you don't want to name every single different brick, you know, a different brick, then just put them in a collection called bricks.
Yeah.
Like you can just like shift or like maybe alt click on the visibility just to view that thing. If you want to just be like, okay, I just want the bits over here, so I can box select only these things.
Yeah, definitely.
It feels like such a make work kind of thing to do. It's like when you tell people you have to name your functions properly and your variables properly. Like the function has to tell you exactly what it does, and it should be an active verb, and it should be in the present tense and all the rest of it. And it just feels like such a weird, arbitrary rule. But then you look at your code 2 years later, and if you haven't done that, you have no idea what's happening. Like if it says receive signal, what signal? From whom? Why? What is it doing?
And like most things, I'll come in with this, and it varies depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I've used a lot in the past parent and child relationships in order to organize collections of objects before collections existed, basically. Problem with doing that is when you suddenly have anything to do with rigging, animation, or any other linking property that relies on the parent-child relationship, suddenly you may not be able to have the hierarchy that you had before. You will often come across it if you introduce armatures to a model for the first time, and suddenly everything's linked together and moving independently. And then when you find out, oh, it's because I parented these two things together, let me just remove the parent. So, you know what's coming at this point. Your model just goes, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I showed you this example earlier. There's someone who makes CC0 game assets, and it's not Kenny, and I'm not going to name them on the channel because they do great stuff and I love their work. But they're doing this in their free time. So they're just throwing out a bunch of things, and often you need to do a little bit of work. They did a pack with a whole bunch of different characters, and I looked at it and said, you know, how easy it would be to use all these characters in a course, just use the same rigging and the same animation for all of them and just change them. And the answer is impossible because he didn't design it that way. Each of these characters has unique rig with unique animations. They're not all the same animations, and they're not all named the same. Like the bones aren't all named the same, which means they work individually. But if you want all of them and you want to swap them out, no, you can't.
You have to bring in each one as a whole independent asset from one another. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've come across this so many times now. We're trying to get assets to work together, especially when you're creating a game where you can swap things out. And the same's true if you're trying to... modular design, I suppose, is ultimately what we're talking about here, whether it's a game or an asset that you're creating. Modular design is awesome in the way that you can just change things around and very quickly end up with a different version of something. But it also comes with a lot of constraints, and... a course that I worked with Penny DeBale on, Procedural Mazes course, I caught myself out so many times. I thought it'd be really cool if you did, and then you add it to the procedural stuff and it doesn't work at all. You end up with something in the wrong place, and it was quite humbling having to take a step back and really think about how an asset was created and how it's going to be ultimately used. And what else can it plug into? What's the interface that you can have? And often with like these maze structures that we were creating, you'd end up with pieces outside of your let's say you had a 3 meter by 3 meter block that you were creating. You'd attach all these pieces together, but you would end up with like a wall or something that was outside of that sort of prohibited zone because it needed to be outside of it so that it blocked off another part of the asset. But man, going backwards and forwards and checking that these things work, And do they work at this rotation? And
That's one fun thing with procedural content is if you're not exactly certain how your rules work and then you tweak something, like the amount of times in Godot Getaway I end up with a city with like half of the roads are missing. You can fall forever just because, or like this road goes beyond the boundary wall, just because I've not been paying attention to this one setting, and now the procedural generation just doesn't work in that city generation.
Have you got any stories of geometry nodes when it comes to that sort of quirkiness and fun?
Oh, have I ever? There's just so many. It's just something that you have to be so aware of. I'm just thinking, maze thing there, because I've done mazes before. Is my internet going? Am I good?
You're back again.
Okay, so like with the mazes, having stuff coming inside and outside is because I've done quite a lot of architectural visualization, and something that I've always done for walls, for example, is I just use a plane and I solidify. So this means that in top view, I can just draw my line where I want the walls, and I can solidify it to the wall thickness.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it was always in Blender, but certainly recently you can offset your solidify by 50%, so you can have even thickness on both sides of your original plane. And I think that's probably one of the things, like with your mazes, if you've only got it offsetting on one side, then you're much more likely to run into issues where you have one wall running in one direction, and then your algorithm just happens to have flipped the next tile around 180 degrees, and then you're offset like 50% on each side of the wall.
Yep.
So it's just like, you just have to be so on it with your procedural system. And a lot of the time it's like, just only rotate things by 180 degrees. Don't go the full 360, because especially if you have rotational symmetry, it's unnecessary, but you also might end up running into issues. So,
and this is another reason why it's vital to name things properly, because when you're dealing with something complex like making a maze or a city, and you don't quite understand the parameter you've just changed, like you might be thinking, make the streets slightly wider, but what you've actually done is move the streets further apart, which is what happened with me. Right? I thought I was giving the player more space. What I was actually doing is just creating massive holes.
You were creating space.
I was.
in a slightly unoptimal way.
If you can build in a method into your tool to
you
really
lost you for a moment there. So we heard, if you can build a tool, that'd be really useful. I can build a tool. I'm very.
I have a hammer somewhere.
If you can build exactly, if you can build a debugging procedure into your tool, that can help you so much. Rather than just being like, this is the one thing that I think this should be used for, which is trouble that I've got into because I was releasing some geometry nodes products, and I was like, these are great. These work perfectly. And then people were sending me messages afterwards like, I've been using it for this and it breaks. And I was like, well, I didn't try moving it off the origin. Why would you do that? And it's just like the simplest things. But if you just have a simple like debugging procedure, or just like a way that's like, let me just test out all of these different things real quick. Because you can build that in. It's an algorithm. You can just be like, just test this 100 things, sort it out for me.
Yep.
So
I had a very similar experience. So after I'd finished working on Godot Getaway, I made a script to export things because I was getting tired of going file, export.
Well, we found a really annoying thing that we don't notice immediately in Blender, because you said, why would you move it off the origin? So as far as Godot is concerned, whatever node it is where its origin is.
Yeah.
So if Mikey moves the mesh up here, the building is here. The collision is here.
We were driving off the map. We'd go through the first floor.
We'd be bumping into a wall on a corner and we would just fall off the map. And it took us ages to figure out the collision is under the street because the origin's in the wrong place.
It was
okay.
It was yeah. When I looked at it, I was like, really?
Which is interesting because you make something with a whole bunch of modifiers and then you forget to apply them. And then you put them in game. It's like, but this is why is my desk flipping around? It's like, because the center of gravity is over there.
Yeah.
So I released my exporter because I thought, someone could grab this, modify it, use it how they want. I don't really care. And just like you, someone used it for a use case that I hadn't.
Mm.
It was on the list of things to do, but they had used it with a model that was animated with armatures, and I wasn't exporting armatures in that particular
Yeah.
version of it because I hadn't gotten to that point in its development. So I was like, "Oh, cool, yeah, maybe, maybe one day." I mean, ultimately, it was a tool for myself and a learning, sort of a learning thing for anybody else wanting to look. But it wasn't really ready, and packaging something for general use is a challenge. It really is.
Have you ever published a game on Steam Market? No. Is the short answer.
Nice and easy.
Yep.
We want to. We've got a couple
we
on
want to.
itch.io.
Yep.
I think
Mag Racer, I think, is the big thing. But bearing in mind, if you want to publish on Steam, first off, you have to pay, right? It's not a huge amount, but it's not trivial. Secondly, we have to practice with the Steam API. There are ways of integrating Steam API with Godot. I haven't played with them because I haven't paid to put anything on, right?
Yes.
So that's a whole project. Third, it kind of needs to be of a certain scale because otherwise no one's going to buy it. Like Mag Racer in its current form, although it's still very much an alpha and all the rest of it, is a lot of fun. But it's 3 levels, 12 teams, no progression, doesn't save your progress, right? Effectively, that's a tech demo. No one is buying that. And at that point, it becomes a size of scale. I was watching Bastion's live stream on Friday, and someone asked the question that people always ask, wait, so is Godot not good enough for a AAA game? And the answer is, it is, but if you're in a position to make a AAA game with that many people and that much expertise, you already know how to change Godot to make it work for a AAA game.
That's a
If you
classic
don't
one.
already know how to do that, no engine is ready for you. Because any engine out of the box is going to need optimization. You're going to have to understand what you're doing to a level that just isn't possible at an indie level. And don't forget, a typical AAA game is dozens or hundreds of people over years. If you're 1 or 2 people, that's a decade's work.
I don't think people appreciate that. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to hear people's aspirations of wanting to create a realistic, whatever it happens to be, a realistic character, a realistic whatever, or wanting to make a AAA game. The truth behind it is very much AAA, or certainly the way that I see it is AAA means you've got the budget and the time to do something incredibly well.
I would also say that AAA is a genre.
Yeah.
More than anything else, because you expect a certain level of visual acuity or visual
Fidelity.
Fidelity, thank you. You expect a certain level of polish. You expect certain kind of soundtracks. Like, you don't expect... Streets of Rogue is a great example. Really fun little game made by one person. It's very polished. It's very fun. If that was a AAA game, that would be an insult to the consumer because that's not what a AAA game is. It's not to do with the quality. It's not even to do with the size. It's to do with these are what we expect. And games like, for example, Grand Theft Auto Online or Far Cry or throw in whatever you like, Call of Duty. I realize I'm picking a lot of shooters, but that tends to be what they are, or even Microsoft Simulator. These are not 1 or 2 person projects. You need so much attention to detail and so much expertise to get the game at that level. But in fairness, that's like saying, will learning to play the piano make me a concert pianist? But not just like that. Like, there's a lot more to that.
The yes was muted, by the way.
Yes, but...
So Arthur has a great question there. Is it hard to use the Steam API with Godot? Do you need to program it?
You need to download the plugin and recompile Godot with the correct version of the plugin and then play with it. None of which I have done.
So it's not super straightforward. I've been playing recently with a lot of different render engines within Blender, Octane Render, Lux Render, just seeing what you can actually get from them. And one of the things that I immediately hit as a wall was, I think Lux render was fine. You could hit a button that said convert these materials from cycles and try and make it as best you can. And I was only using a simple glass shade to check out caustics. But long story short, it meant that, hang on a minute, you've got to make this decision quite early on. If you're going to use a different render engine, you need to create your material stack based for that render engine. And a lot of these aren't light cycles. They use a different technology in order to actually do the calculations and the light path calculations. So you have to bear all of that in mind. It's not just a matter of like moving from Godot 3 to Godot 4, or like going from Blender 2. Blender Render back in the day to Eevee. That wouldn't be possible. We're very, very, very lucky that Blender Eevee and Cycles are so intercompatible. That's something the Blender devs have done wonders doing. They are two separate render engines. In fact, one of the biggest things I think with lighting is one of the biggest things difference between the two, because of the way the lighting engines work in both anyway. But lights in, I believe it's Cycles, need a lot more power to them for the same brightness as you would get naturally in Eevee. But Eevee doesn't have any bounce or anything along those lines. So when playing with these different render engines, it became apparent that not only do you need to try loads of different settings, but it's a whole new thing you have to learn that's completely separate from Blender. And it sort of brought it back to me that Blender isn't just one program. Blender is a suite of programs that work together completely seamlessly most of the time.
To go back to Arthur's question, if you want to ask about the Steam API, I would ask the devs of Rogue State Revolution, who released their game on Steam last week, the week before. I'm going to put the thing in the chat. Mikey's going to have to okay the link.
I think you've got. I think so.
Okay.
I gave you a spanner.
Other game that was released a couple of weeks back. It's been a long time in development, but they'd be in a much better position to answer things like how hard is the Steam API to integrate with Godot? Because I just haven't looked at it. We saw what was involved. It's not within scope for a course, because I'm going to have to assume you can afford £100 or $100 to pay to Steam for the license for this game, and that you know how to compile the engine. Like, that's just not beginner content.
Yeah, very
it's a bit
so.
like, as Bass was saying on his live stream, if you're talking about making a AAA game, if you understand how to go into the engine and tweak it, because it's an open source engine, change the way it handles it so that you can easily do chunk loading, of course you can have a AAA open world game. If you don't know what that means, you're probably not able to make a AAA game yet.
Got a few more milestones to hit. I was going to say one of the things that we're conscious of is, at the moment, we are educators primarily, and we have an ambition to create something more as well on top of that. And as Jan was saying earlier, if we've got a spare 3 years that we can take off, and that's honestly what it would take to build a fully fledged game. You have to be able to have the time and resources to live, obviously, with that. So buy all of our courses today, please.
£9 each. I mean, we do love making these games. Mag Racer is a lot of fun, and I would very much like to see what we can get Aaron involved with and play with and all the rest of it. None of this is promise. We have no agreement or contract. This is just like, here's a fun game. He looked at it a couple of weeks back. It's like, oh, this is a lot of fun. But it's just adding.
It's a lot of fun.
Is great, right? Just little things like, I made a very, very, very simple crafting in Blender over like 20 minutes that had a bunch of geometry issues and all the rest of it, because I'm not a Blender teacher. I just threw something together so that I could play with it in Godot and see how it works. Getting those first assets from Mikey just changed the feel of the game so much. Although it also led to about 3 times as long of Mikey working the assets, of him and I going, this isn't working. Why isn't this working? Like, this tiny texel here isn't mapped. And it's causing massive problems, because that's the bit the player's looking at.
Or geometry. So one of the things we were doing during the prototype stage is you just bash out a model as quickly as you can. The idea is to get the shape, the silhouette, the feel of the craft. And one of the things that we did manage to achieve is all of the craft have the same attributes. They have the same thrust, the same braking, the same agility, all of that, the same health.
It's the same craft with a different mesh.
It's the same craft with a different mesh, but they fly differently. They all, and I can't explain it other than the fact you, in your head, you're just making stuff up that this is a bigger craft.
It's chunky, and it's got a much lower sound, and it's a heavy craft. Look at it; it's heavy. I'm going to drive it like heavy.
So it was amazing, and one of the craft, the Delta, I just couldn't fly at all. I would crash it around every corner. Yet this little nimble ship I could control really well, and I felt like I was being nimble and flying in and out. Anyway, back to the problem was that these models were created for that purpose, and then we had to start rebuilding them all because none of them were game optimized. I mean, having a hero asset at 500,000 polygons is not a big deal. However, those were very wasted because I modeled all the individual bolts on a particular craft.
Well, so the simplest one is the Delta, and we thought that's going to be the easiest. And we looked at the geometry on it, and it was actually causing actual frame drops because the grill on the back
was real geometry.
Yeah, so you actually had this tiny, tiny grating that no one would see, but Godot's trying to calculate that because when you're modeling it, it's like, yeah, just put an array, it's done.
Yeah.
But then into Game Engine, it's like the simplest craft has 4 times the vertices of any other craft.
All from one part as well. And
I keep talking about we should really get a game jam going with teams from Blender and Godot to get people like figuring out what, because you learn so much as part of a team like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut Aaron off there.
No, I was going to say something similar. Like I've done game jams with like VR experiences, and it's so valuable. Like if you're an artist and you start collabing with a coder, you learn so much about the workflow that you had no idea about. So much about like optimization, bringing stuff into engines.
You weren't even aware you were taking. Like bad habits you've picked up that never bothered you, so you never noticed them, and then someone else gets your work is like, I can't use this.
Yeah, why won't you auto UV unwrap work? It should work. You mean I've got to manually unwrap this craft? I don't like unwrapping.
He's in the middle of finishing the free Blender content, and he's getting Aaron's stuff ready. And I'm poking him like, can you just get me the working craft? Get me the working craft. Get me the work. So he's like, fine, here you go. It's done. And he's applied all transforms. So I'm all excited. I can see it's got animations. I put them in, I press play, and none of the animations actually change anything. They're all keyframed beautifully. Nothing's changed. And I'm like, Mikey, can you look at it again? And it turned out he was in such a rush. He'd applied the armature.
I applied the armature modifier.
So it came through.
The bones were moving.
Didn't move anything.
So yeah, it's. I mean that's the classic. I'm just going to press export. Here you go. Bye.
Yeah, I'm in a rush. I've got 5 other things to do. Here's your asset.
Again, if I'd written myself, that's the other thing about writing a script. If you know exactly your process of export, I could have automatically applied all of those and then just added another armature back again, or applied everything but a armature modifier, and that in itself would have solved that issue.
Yeah.
But then I've got to think about, well, is it worth me sitting down for maybe 2 or 3 hours writing a script, testing a script, testing again, for something that only takes a few clicks? So that there's
especially on the bigger projects, but in any kind of game, the thing that we've learned is consistency is everything. If I'm going to use assets that Mikey gives me or Aaron gives me a different time each way, he has no way of designing that optimally. But if we're making it, especially something the size of Mag Racer, which is already like 1 point something gig, the moment an asset isn't following the same criteria as everything else, it becomes almost unusable. Because suddenly we got to a case where one craft had no animations, and I had to rewrite the code just for that craft to bypass all the animation calls, which was an extra hour, which was fine at that stage, right? It was still the prototyping, but it's the moment you deviate from that consistency, it throws everything off. Yeah, pre-flight checklist is a great way of putting it.
Yes, it's always worth getting it right. It's more Melicom has a brilliant point there. It always feels like you're doing work for work's sake,
Mm.
but ultimately it just becomes part of the process. And it's the same with naming. It's the same with recording videos. You know, check 1, 2, is everything working before we go live? We make sure that YouTube is at least getting a video signal. If something goes wrong afterwards, you know.
I recorded a 20-minute video about putting audio into a game, and I managed to mute both the game and my microphone.
Oh, nice.
That's perfect.
I think what's interesting as well is it's never the stuff that you think is going to take a long time.
Yeah.
It's the tiniest things you never even thought of. I mean, the thing that really slowed us down was, how do you display who's in first position when your course isn't a straight line? If it's a straight line, this is an easy problem, right? Who is closest to the finish? But closest to the finish means nothing on a loop, especially if it's not a perfect circle. The moment you start getting wibbly wobbly bits and uppy downy bits. We had a bridge on one course, and going under the bridge would put you into first place briefly, which would really annoy whoever had just crossed the finish line and suddenly lost, right? And that took ages to solve. And like, how complicated a solution do I want to make this? Like, do I do this by who crossed the checkpoint and put a checkpoint every 10 meters? Do I like, and then what happens with 5 meters? It's weird. It's the tiny little differences. And it reminds me of the 90-90 rule, which is the first 90% of your game take 90% of your time, and the last 10% of your game take 90% of your time. Because all the little things you never thought about, like, just throw in like position markers or a repair system. And the next thing you know, your entire game has to be rewritten because it doesn't work.
Yes, I've found when I've done any coding, flowcharts are incredibly useful to me, understanding what is supposed to be changing, and then hopefully when you write your code from those flowcharts, or hopefully when I write my code from those flowcharts, I'm only touching the things I should be touching and not changing other parts. And obviously with a flowchart, for me, it's very visual. That's why I go down that route. But you can start to, as you follow it around manually, you can start to see problems because you're actually going round the game loop. Essentially, you're going round and you're producing the game on paper, and hopefully it works. And sometimes you're like,
me, the analogy I use a lot is coding is like dealing with a grumpy genie. You'll get exactly what you asked for and not what you wanted. And it's interesting because you build these little narratives when you're making something, right? It looks like a bunny. It's a bunny, right? It is jumping. It's not jumping. It's moving X pixels up the screen, and then it's being pulled down, right? And any part of that code that's wrong will change the behavior. The tiniest typo means that what you're actually asking is, if I press space or I am a player, do the following.
Yeah.
Because you've put a punctuation mark in the wrong place. Being aware of what you're actually asking the machine to do as opposed to what you want the machine to do is such a weird shift for me, because I'm used to people just understanding the language.
So Daz raises a point. Organization is key.
That's not Daz. That's Arturo.
Oh,
That's right.
it is quite. So I can't read. There's Daz. Saved by the time loop. Right. Organization is key. Yeah. So the one problem I found with trying to organize things is, and that is essentially a course is a flowchart, but there are so many entry points and exit points for lessons and going through. He'll take it. Good boy. So there are so many entry points and exit points when it comes to teaching someone something. You're like, well, do I do this bit first or this bit first? Because they're both dependent, or something else is both dependent on those two things. But how do you approach it? And is this better in the current project state? I've had that plenty of times where I want to teach loop cuts next, but none of my geometry will support loop cuts. Best teach something else before I get to that point.
I mean, I guess curriculum development is a great way of looking at it, because I always start with what's the final result, right? What's the student going to do, and then what's the step just before that? But really, the question is, what actually do I want the computer to be doing? Not what I want it to look like, what I want it to feel like. What is it doing on a moment-by-moment thing? And it goes back to procedural materials, an Aaron's course. Understanding those parameters is, what am I actually asking the machine to do? And it can be very, like I need the flower to be bigger at this point, so I need some sort of math tweaky thing to make it bigger.
Multiplier.
It's so easy to get lost in the story of, I've written this code, it does this thing, or I've written this rule, it does this thing, and not realize what I've actually asked it to do looks the same right now, but in 3 months' time, I've just introduced this weird bug that's going to bite me.
It's so when you're doing little things as well, it's there's 100 different ways to do anything, but then you don't realize until you've got 100 different things happening at the same time, the way that you're doing each one is incredibly unoptimal. Like you're taking so long to get to the answer, even if in a silo, that thing, like that sandbox thing, it makes sense. Like you get to the finish line and it's great. But then, just thinking about shaders, if you start putting Voronoi with a smooth F1 on, which is a great way to make like fake looking caustics or fake real looking caustics, but it's also incredibly slow. If you do a 4-dimensional Voronoi F1 smoothed and you animate the W to make it like, nice little shimmer, no, you're going to completely kill your frame rate just instantly. Nobody knows why, but then it's like, well, it's because you have 27 iterations of your Voronoi going on at the same time.
What it reminds me of is a few months back, a modder found why Grand Theft Auto takes forever to load, especially the online version. And it was because whoever had originally written the item code knew this is an online game, there's going to be hackers and dupers, so I'm just going to run a security check whenever we add an object. But the way they wrote it was, whenever you add an object to this list, check the list. Which meant that it was running a calculation 65 million times.
Oops.
That's
and
too many times.
It's such a huge game that it would take you 10 to 15 minutes to load in.
It's been a common complaint of mine every time I've loaded it up.
So they've managed to cut it down to like 1 or 2 minutes. Because this guy found the solution, and Rockstar paid him like $10,000. Like, thank you. But it's the sort of thing, like, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. It's an online game. These things are worth actual real money that people can pay. Let's just check that you should have this thing. Not let's check this with every single object that's in the game.
I wonder if that could be managed with a blockchain.
Don't. I'm so over blockchains.
Sorry, I had to throw that in. That's a topic for another day, definitely.
Need a full round table on that.
Oh, blimey. No. I'll go sit out in the garden with a glass of wine and let other people sit around that table.
That's someone else's table, I think. I'm sure you could do some fun stuff with blockchains, but I'm so over that tech. Like, I had so many students tell me it was the future of currency. Like, they're still humans. Like,
no, Archer, don't go there. Don't go there.
But
awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to do it. So to wrap up, because we have some people joining in, Aaron's course on procedural materials in Blender has been live for 2 weeks now. It's a really cool course, and it's part of our greater Blender creative series, which is very much in production. Which Mikey and Mine's Gone Blank are working on.
Paul,
thank you.
Yeah.
Aaron has done his bit. He's happy. The Discovering Godot course is being moved over to Canopy. If you already own it, nothing has changed. You still have access to the original one with that company. You will do so as long as Udemy exists. That is a promise that Udemy has made to you, so you lose nothing. Don't worry. We want to make a bigger version of Cube Kickabout, probably with a different name, because it won't be cubes. Mag Racer is fun. Procedural generation is awesome. Bugs are bad.
So what we need to do is also make Mag Racer like multiplayer and stuff, and then we can all play that.
Open world multiplayer Mag Racer. Yes, please.
With blockchain. We actually looked at making Mag Racer an online multiplayer game, and we thought we just use the same tech as Gotta Getaway. Gotta Getaway, the cars go at 20 miles per hour. Mag Racer, we use in kilometers. They boost up to 800 kilometers per hour. The tiny difference in latency makes such a huge difference. I started getting seasick.
Rubber
Because-
banding doesn't even cover it.
Constantly. Like, you couldn't do anything.
Yeah, something like that. Every pod's an NFT.
Every pod's an NFT. And what was the other one? There was another point we made. Next one.
Medicon was just saying there that definitely needs client-side prediction.
It does. It would need client-side prediction. It would need a server, a dedicated server. Like, that's not even scope creep. I mean, at that point, you need to write the whole game again. You can't just add multiplayer in.
Yeah.
Multiplayer is a first level, is a first premise decision because it impacts everything else. If you took the Gotta Getaway course, just beeping the horn, how is that handled? Who's responsible for letting all the players know this horn has been beeped?
There's a classic example with that. If you beep a horn and you send to, and let's say you've got a dedicated server, you send to the server that you've beeped your horn. It sends it out to all the other client machines. It beeps your horn, but then you hear your horn again because it's also sent it back to you. So you've got to remember all sorts of things like culling certain information because you don't need it going back to the person who sent the information. It's like, yeah, I know I sent it.
We have a problem where in Gotta Getaway, if you're a criminal and you're carrying cash and you hit a wall, you drop some of the cash, which means you've got money lying around. If anyone drives over there, you can pick it up. The exact moment you pick up that cash and how much you've picked up is going to vary depending if you're on the client or the host. So who's responsible for that? And if you're letting the client be responsible for that, you get a situation like GTA Online, where hacking is really easy because everything is stored on the client. Like, there are no servers. It's a peer-to-peer game, which means if you can access your own client, you can change everything. Gotta Getaway, that's not an issue because it's a fun little 2 to 4 player game. But if you want to start getting a serious competitive AAA game, you need to keep that in mind, or be Rockstar and make so much money you don't really care.
It's just a mild inconvenience.
Yeah.
It's nice to see the player base being involved, though, isn't it? You know,
It is.
Working on your games for you. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, in fairness, that's a really toxic community most of the time. Like, I love playing GTA Online every now and again, but I normally just hop out into a private server or play with Mikey and some friends, or just, if I have nothing else to do, I'll just drive around the place and do some stuff. Because they've created a game that encourages toxic behavior. Like, it rewards it. Like, that's, you know, where the fun is, right? You create a huge traffic accident and blow everything up. And if there's other players, they're now a part of your content. Like, that's...
and you know, 18-year-old me, I was going to say 12-year-old me. I would be playing it if I was 12. But 18-year-old me would quite happily just go around the map trolling people. That would be fun.
Yep.
It'd be very disruptive, but there's no way of opting out of that. So yeah. Or there is. I wish that there is a way that you can kick yourself out to a private lobby. Why don't they just add private lobby? And you can just chill with friends and do whatever.
But they gate you out of some content. This is a whole stream for the day. Essentially, the experience they want you to have is an open world game with strangers. The experience I want to have is an open world game with friends. I'm trying to make that game work in a way that isn't the player experience they want.
Yeah.
They want me to play a competitive game with people shooting at me while I'm trying to get stuff done. I'm not interested in that. I'm 45. Like, I've done that. At this point, I just want to drive my stolen car to the bank. Okay. Just like real life.
Awesome.
Yep.
So, as in proper fashion, we've decided to not start wrapping up and not. So, has anybody got any questions while we're here? Just fire away. Hopefully,
I'm very glad you enjoyed
answer
it.
them.
It was a lot of fun to make. It was a lot of fun to play around with, and it was one of those games that really started off, like most of the good stuff we make, with me making a little thing, and Mikey says, that looks fun, let me give you some assets. And the next thing we know, it's like, okay, we need online multiplayer, we need electro swing, we need
On making the electro swing was awesome. I would really love to make another music course. That would be fantastic.
It's the time. Because I still need those Mag Racer assets. Like, it's,
I need to move to a silo somewhere, just me.
I mean, it's going well. So is it possible to go through and add a pattern to our tiles in the Pro Material course?
To add a pattern to the tiles, as in add a texture to each individual tile? Yes, it would be. If it would require a little bit of re-wrangling the nodes.
Please put Node Wrangler on your business cards.
I always get this. People ask me questions while I'm like sat in bed or something, and I'm like, okay, now I have to like do mental nodes. There's a point when you're making the tiles where you have ping pong in the X direction and a ping pong in the Y direction. And I think what we do is we smooth minimum them to get them to work together. But if in parallel you were to use a combine XYZ and put the X ping pong into the X and the Y ping pong into the Y, then now what you've done is you've created a what is called a quarter matched UV space. So each quarter is symmetrical to one another, which is what you see quite a lot with decorative tiles. So then if you were to go and put a texture on that coordinate space that you've just made, it would be four-way symmetrical on your tile. So that would be one way to add a texture very quickly. And obviously you have your random value per tile. So you could also do a random offset for each one of those and give you a completely unique texture coordinate space per tile. So that would be probably the easiest way to go about that. So there we go.
I just enjoyed ping pong.
Ping pong. Yeah.
Yes. I like that. Create a new UV texture coordinate space on each quarter of the tile. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm gonna go try it. I'm gonna go try it later.
Use a Mandelbrot or like that. You could use Perlin noise, I guess.
You actually could. You literally could.
Yeah.
There was someone on my Discord was making their own custom noise the other day, and then they were just like, "It's great." So my Discord is specifically around procedural generation and scripting and things like this. So there's a lot of people who get involved there are like crazy math head people, which is nuts. Like I'm not mathsy really at all, and then they come out like making their own render. So, two people have made cycles style render engines like ray tracers inside Eevee using the world shader. Like they've made a path tracer themselves with nodes, which is just kind of crazy. But yeah, you can do anything with the shaders. It's nuts.
I'm going to let someone else handle Melicon's last question.
I'll let Aaron. I'm not going to put words in Aaron's mouth.
Can we get an amendment to the
procedural materials asterisk? Like what's that?
or a fully in-depth course.
Oh, I wonder if that's going to happen.
I wonder.
Yeah, it should do. It should do. It's on my books. There's
nice.
I've got a list of things that I'm
ticking
both over with, but yeah, I've got a list. So that, nice. There should be more. There should be more content for shaders.
Nice.
I think there should be more Aaron content.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All hail, Aaron. If everybody chips in, that's good.
Bidding war himself.
Thanks, Buttercup.
I feel like that's probably a good place to wrap things up.
I do as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening and our shenanigans. It's always great to have you all here. Thanks for being able to make it as well. It's good to see you.
It is.
Oh, thanks.
And nice one on the course again.
Oh, cheers very much.
So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again, hopefully, next week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. I'm waving with the hand I need to click with.
Don't do that. Just click the button.